Today we're going to be doing John chapter 6, in which Jesus performs a miracle, the feeding of a multitude, and then a second miracle right following that of walking on the sea. And then there is a series of conversations. First, Jesus dialogues with the crowd, and then with the crowd and the disciples, and then finally with the disciples alone. And all of that is to unpack the symbolism that's part of these two miracles. So I'm going to give a little bit of overview about some of the things that we need to be listening for, and then we'll be able to just read section by section, open it up, and then discuss each section. So there are two things that are, well, there's several things that are really important about this, but bread is almost a synonym for life. 50% of a person's caloric intake came from bread. The poorer you were, and most people were subsistence people, you ate barley bread, which is harder to digest, has lower protein and nutritional value, but bread and life are conjoined in the minds of the first century people. The second thing to remember is whenever you are outside of your village, you're in the wild place. And the wild place is where the demons are. The wild place is a place of danger. The wild place is to be avoided at cost. So if indeed you go into the wild place, you want to go with others. You never want to go alone. Except that Jesus consistently retreats into the mountain or onto the mountain for prayer. So it's one of those indicators which we would usually miss, and what it symbolizes is that Jesus is unafraid of the spiritual powers that are wild in the world. So we'll have Jesus in two settings where he's in one of those wild places today. The distribution of the miracle of the feeding of the thousands is recorded in all four Gospels. It's recorded twice in Matthew and Mark, and also strangely included in John as well. Some people wonder, however, if John's source is not different from the synoptic source. The synoptic source is very tied into he blessed the bread, broke it, and then gave it to his disciples to distribute. Almost the pattern of the words of institution. And in John, those words are not present. He blesses the bread, and then Jesus distributes it all. And so it's a slightly different orientation. Also in the Gospel of John, there is no breaking of the bread and sharing of the cup at the Last Supper. There's only the foot washing, and then it moves right into the long time. So John he's not as liturgical as the synoptics are in this particular instance. So we'll go into that more, but I just wanted you to know that it's a shared story, but it appears to come from a different source. John is very persistent about saying where something is taking place. He often gives you a location. Sometimes he'll even give you a time of day. And that is to keep you tied down to, this is really happening. This was a physical event. John doesn't stay with the physical side too long. He almost always moves into the spiritual dynamics. But he wants you to know that these are things that happen. And finally, the continuing difficulty for us reading John and for John writing is that he takes language that is familiar to the people, bread equals life, and he pours a new meaning into that language. So that when you enter into it, you see the symbolism and the connections, but he seems to be saying and using those words in a whole new way. And that's because, Carmen, he's a new church development pastor, and he's teaching his congregation how they're going to talk about the things that pertain to God. Does that make sense? All right. We're going to start with chapter 6. I'll read the first 15 verses, and then we'll go over that a little bit more together, and then as a discussion. John 6, beginning at the first through the 15th verse. After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. And when he looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get even a little. So one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they all sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also with the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they were satisfied, he told the disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over, so that nothing may be lost." And they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. And when the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come to the world." When Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him a king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. Okay, now it's stated that the crowd is there because they have observed the healings that Jesus has done. And it's near the Passover time, which means on everybody's mind is the story of the Exodus. The story of the Exodus includes the provision of manna, right? Provision of bread that was given to the people in the wilderness, and that's going to tie into this story as well. There's a boy who has a very poor lunch, 5 barley loaves. A loaf is about like this. See, it's 1 portion. A loaf is 1 portion, and he has a couple fish. Now, again, John doesn't include the distribution, anything that we would commonly say and see him giving it to his disciples to give out to the people. But instead, Jesus distributes everything himself. The theological significance of this will become clear as we continue on, for Jesus will say that he is actually the bread. He's the one. He's giving bread to them, but in the act of doing that, they will later see, he was giving himself to us. The leftovers that are gathered up 12 baskets, perhaps symbolic of the 12 tribes, or maybe just another sign of the overabundance of God's grace. Remember those big jars of water that became wine? Much more than any party, even a long and well-populated party, could probably have consumed. Here again, there's an abundance that's provided. And the text says, so that nothing will be wasted. So if it's not used now, maybe it will be used later. Again, a commentary on the graciousness of God. The crowd responds, a bit surprisingly, this is the prophet, let's take him and make him our king. And so, as they're ready to make him a king, quote, by force, Jesus runs up the mountain and escapes from the people. But now we're going to jump from one miracle to the next. So I'm reading from 16 through 24. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them, and the sea became rough because of a strong wind blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were terrified. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." Then they wanted to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land toward which they were going. The next day, the crowd that had stayed on the other side of the sea saw that there had been only one boat there. And they also saw that Jesus had not got into the boat with his disciples, but that his disciples had gone away alone. Then some boats from Tiberias came near the place where they had eaten the bread after the Lord had given thanks. So when the crowd saw that neither Jesus nor his disciples were there, they went to Capernaum looking for Jesus. Yeah, we're going to stop there. So this is the walking on the sea miracle in Matthew and in Mark. It is also linked to one of the feeding of the 5,000 or 4,000. So there's a suggestion that in the oral tradition, these two were somehow always linked, whether they had a similar teaching message, or whether they were just part of the Galilean signs. So the story is written from the perspective of the disciples, and they must have known ahead of time what Jesus' travel plans were, right? So they take off, assuming he's going to come in the boat behind, because there's one boat left on the shore, and they take off going to where they know they're supposed to go, and Jesus is still up on the mountain praying. In John, the disciples' fear is not explained. I mean, you would assume it's because of the rolling sea, but it doesn't necessarily. In the other accounts, they were terrified and water was coming into the boat, and they were sure that they were going to drown. But they're just afraid at this point. Reminding you again that the other place of wildness is the sea, distinct from the water. Jesus does not come walking to them on the water, but comes walking to them on the sea. The sea, the place of original chaos and all things ununderstood. And that again, it's the image of Jesus' power and confidence that he fears not the unknown or the unruly powers that may be within that unknown. That also picks up some other Old Testament imagery, for example, in 2nd Isaiah, or it's from 43 on, 2nd Isaiah. In 2nd Isaiah, there's a description of God making a pathway through the sea as the exiles return. And in Job, there's another illustration of the God who walks upon the waters of the sea. So that there's some interesting little connections back to the Old Testament, which we don't necessarily hear. So Jesus speaks to him, and now this is the first time he'll say this. He says, I am, the Hebrew word for Yahweh. I am here. In our translation, it says, it is I. But the Greek is, I am, and then here. So the I am, and again, echoing 2nd Isaiah 51:12, I am he who comforts you. And then followed by Jesus' kind of summary of the gospel, which is, do not be afraid. Do not be afraid, which we also know is whenever an angel steps up to interact with human beings, the first thing they say as an angel is, don't be afraid. I'm here for good. I'm bringing a good message. So Jesus does not, quote, calm the waters. He rather reveals his power over them and over all dangers in a way that these men were anticipating. The disciples want to bring him into the boat, but immediately they're on shore. And again, that's one of those odd to explain moments. Have you ever been in an accident and the accident worked really slowly and then immediately you were in the hospital and you kind of lost that space in between? It could be that kind of a feeling that they're talking about. This miracle ends abruptly because it's really not about a physical miracle. It's about a theophany, about a disclosing of the divine nature of Jesus. Meanwhile, back on the other side, the crowd that had been fed the previous day and probably been feasting on the leftovers have decided to go across the sea to see if Jesus somehow snuck him over there without them noticing it. And they're also headed to Capernaum. So 2 miracles back to back. Okay, so we're ready to go, and I'm going to read 25 through 34. 25. When they found him on the other side of the sea, they said to him, Rabbi, when did you come here? Jesus answered them, very truly I tell you, you are looking for me not because you saw signs, but because you ate your fill of the loaves. Do not work for the food that perishes, but for the food that endures to eternal life. For the Son of Man which the Son of Man will give you. For it is on him that God the Father has set his seal. And then they said to him, what must we do to perform the works of God? And Jesus answered them, this is the work of God, that you believe in him whom he has sent. And so they said to him, what signs are you going to give us then so that we may see it and believe? What works are you going to perform? Our ancestors ate manna in the wilderness. As it is written, he gave them bread from heaven. Then Jesus said to him, very truly I tell you, it was not Moses who gave the bread from heaven, but it is my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is that which comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. They said to him, Sir, give us this bread always. So now the crowd arrives, and Jesus perceives that they're there because of the superficial aspect of a miracle. The superficial aspect is the bread was multiplied and everybody had enough, or the healing happened. That's the superficial side. That's what we always want. But the deeper aspect of a miracle is that it reveals God's presence and God's work within our everyday lives. That God is at work and we see it in this exceptional moment. So they're a little, well, they're interested in this gift that Jesus now says he's going to give them. He's going to give them God's gift of life. Remember I said before that life and bread went together. So they're connecting the dots, and they know that if they're going to get bread, they're going to have to earn it, right? In the society, if you don't work, you don't have any food. So they ask, what do I need to do in order to earn this bread? And Jesus says, well, the only work, quote, quote, that you have to do is not work at all. You need to believe in Jesus, the one whom God has sent. And the crowd then, they're like talking out of both sides of their mouth. Then they say, oh, okay, well, we'll do that, but you'll have to show us some signs so we can do this. And after all, our ancestors got manna in the heavens, in the wilderness, and this is like a day after they got bread on the hillside, right? So they want another sign, and if they only get that, then they'll be able to believe. And then, you remember I told you that every time in John it reads, very, verily, verily, or something like that, it's amen, amen, and it's like the punctuation mark for you to know that the next words are going to be really important and they're going to be about God, so pay attention. So he says, amen, amen. Didn't you notice that it wasn't really Moses giving that bread, but it was God giving the bread through Moses? And the bread of God comes down from heaven. This coming down and going up is the descent and ascent language that John uses throughout his gospel. Comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. That bread gives life to the world. And he's very tactful and does not remind them that they ate that exact bread the day before. So, responding as the woman at the well, on the superficial level, they say exactly the same sense. She says, give me this water that I'll never have to come here and draw again. And they say, give us the bread that we may always have it. So you've got the beginnings of an interpretation, but the conversation misses each other. Jesus takes their words, tries to open them up, and they go back to closed words. The crowd begins to complain and grumble, and that links back to a stream within the Old Testament called the murmurings in the wilderness, the grumblings. And it's to remind the people, look at how you behaved in the wilderness. You want to do all of that over again. Try not to. The connection once again. Bread and manna, mumbling in the wilderness, and Jesus offering this gift of life. I start at 43, right after they have said, isn't this Joseph's son? How can he say he's come down from heaven? And then at 43, Jesus continues. Jesus answered them, do not complain among yourselves. No one can come to me unless drawn by the Father who sent me, and I will raise that person up on the last day. It is written by the prophets, and they shall be taught by God. Everyone who has heard and learned from the Father comes to me. Not that anyone has seen the Father except the one who is from God, who has seen him. So Jesus, I'm going to comment as we go along. So Jesus essentially says, I can't make you believe, but God is working to help you believe. But you have to do the work of understanding. You have to be taught. You need some learning. And, but yet you won't get anywhere unless God is actually in that, pulling you towards me. And then he does another amen, amen at 47. Very truly I tell you, whoever believes has eternal life. That's present tense. That's not past tense or future tense. I am the bread of life. Your ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness and they died. This is the bread that comes down from heaven so that one may eat of it and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats of this bread will live forever. The bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh. We're back to incarnation language. You can't eat a person. A person does not become bread and you can break off their little finger and eat it. That's not what we're talking about. Neither are we talking about cannibalism, although both of those things were ascribed to the early Christian community. If you can't think symbolically, this makes no sense. It makes no sense. So we'll continue on and it'll make less sense. Okay, 52. The Jews then disputed among themselves, how can this man give us his flesh to eat? So Jesus said to them, Amen, amen, very truly, I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you will have no life in you. Pause. The life and blood mean the same as bread and life. Okay? So remember, the Jews are not allowed to eat any meat with the life in it, the blood in it. And so now we have the potentiality of both of these elements. Bread gives life, blood gives life. And Jesus says, unless you get that from me, you're not going to have it. So where are we? 56. Those who eat my flesh and drink my blood abide in me and I in them. The most important word being abide. And when we get to the Last Supper monologue, that last discourse, it's all about abiding. How will you stay with Jesus and in Jesus? And this is suggesting that abiding has to do with what are the early Christians already practicing? Holy Communion, the Eucharist. That is a way of abiding in Jesus. And he continues on. Just as the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so whoever eats me will live because of me. This is the bread that came down from heaven, not like that which your ancestors ate and died. That was physical bread. But the one who eats this bread, this spiritual bread, will live forever. He said these things while he was teaching in the synagogue at Capernaum. Now, very quickly, the disciples don't get it. Don't worry that you're not getting it because they didn't get it either. When many of his disciples heard it, they said, this is a difficult teaching. Who can accept it? But Jesus, being aware that his disciples were complaining about it, said to him, does this offend you? Then what if you were to see the Son of Man ascending to where he was before? What if you really saw the ascension, which they really did later on? What if you really saw this? It's the Spirit that gives life, and the flesh is useless. The words that I have spoken to you are spirit and life. So what are you supposed to be doing? You're supposed to be listening to the words, not getting hung up on the imagery, but penetrating to the spiritual meaning of the words. 64. But among you there are some who do not believe. For Jesus knew from the first those who were the ones who would who did not believe him, and the one that would betray him. And he said, quote, "For this reason I have told you that no one can come to me unless it is granted by the Father." Now, because of this, many of the disciples turned back. So this is a point before which the 12 were firmly established as the 12. The Gospel of John never names the 12. He doesn't talk about the 12. I think this is the only time he uses the 12. He doesn't even use it here. So Jesus asked the 12, "Do you also wish to go away?" And Simon Peter answered him, "Lord, to whom can we go? You have the words of eternal life." Almost as if he's getting it, right? Almost as if he's getting it. "We have come to believe," and what more? "Know." They have been taught, they have learned, and now they know that you are the Holy One of God. This particular title for Jesus is used only here in the Gospel of John. And Jesus answered them, "Did I not choose you, the 12, and yet among you one is a devil?" He was speaking of Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, for he, though he was one of the 12, was going to betray him. What does this mean? It means that God can call and call and call, and unless you believe and learn and know and do, the calling is ineffectual. Election does not mean you got an easy street in. You still have to do the work of being a disciple, of knowing and believing. That is it for the time today. I'm sorry we had to rush at the end, but it's extremely rich. And I just hope that as you go along in your hearing of the Gospel of John, that you'll begin to sense some of the other power that's there. Thank you.